Who would be so cruel as to mutilate the body? A deep-seated grudge? Dear listeners, welcome back. Will justice be served for the victim today? Chapter 32: A High-Bred Gentleman. The central figure in the coroner's court that day was undoubtedly the Earl of Brocklesby in deep black, which contrasted strongly with his florid complexion and fair hair. Sir Marmaduke Ingersoll, his solicitor, was with him, and he had already performed the painful duty of identifying the deceased as his brother. This had been an exceedingly painful duty owing to the terribly mutilated state of the body and face, but the clothes and various trinkets he wore, including a signet ring, had fortunately not tempted the brutal assassin, and it was through them chiefly that Lord Brocklesby was able to swear to the identity of his brother. The various employees at the hotel gave evidence as to the discovery of the body, and the medical officer gave his opinion as to the immediate cause of death. Deceased had evidently been struck at the back of the head with a poker or heavy stick, the murderer then venting his blind fury upon the body by battering in the face and bruising it in a way that certainly suggested the work of a maniac. Then the Earl of Brocklesby was called, and was requested by the coroner to state when he had last seen his brother alive. "The morning before his death," replied his lordship. "He came up to Birmingham by an early train, and I drove up from Brocklesby to see him. I got to the hotel at 11 o'clock and stayed with him for about an hour." "And that is the last you saw of the deceased?" "That is the last I saw of him," replied Lord Brocklesby. He seemed to hesitate for a moment or two as if in thought whether he should speak or not, and then to suddenly make up his mind to speak, for he added, "I stayed in town the whole of that day and only drove back to Brocklesby late in the evening. I had some business to transact and put up at the Grand, as I usually do, and dined with some friends." "Would you tell us at what time you returned to Brocklesby Castle?" "I think it must have been about 11 o'clock. It is a 7-mile drive from here." "I believe," said the coroner after a slight pause, during which the attention of all the spectators was riveted upon the handsome figure of the young man as he stood in the witness box, the very personification of a high-bred gentleman. "I believe that I am right in stating that there was an unfortunate legal dispute between your lordship and your brother." "That is so." The coroner stroked his chin thoughtfully for a moment or two. Then he added, "In the event of the deceased's claim to the joint title and revenues of de Genneville being held good in the courts of law, there would be a great importance, would there not, attached to his marriage, which was to have taken place on the 15th? "In that event, there certainly would be." "Is the jury to understand, then, that you and the deceased parted on amicable terms after your interview with him in the morning?" The Earl of Brocklesby hesitated again for a minute or two while the crowd and the jury hung breathless on his lips. "There was no enmity between us," he replied at last, "from which we may gather that there may have been, shall I say, a slight disagreement at that interview? My brother had unfortunately been misled by the misrepresentations or perhaps the too optimistic views of his lawyer. He had been dragged into litigation on the strength of an old family document which he had never seen, which, moreover, is antiquated, and, owing to certain wording in it, invalid. I thought that it would be kinder and more considerate if I were to let my brother judge of the document for himself. I knew that when he had seen it he would be convinced of the absolutely futile basis of his claim, and that it would be a terrible disappointment to him. That is the reason why I wished to see him myself about it, rather than to do it through the more formal, perhaps more correct, medium of our respective lawyers. I placed the facts before him with, on my part, a perfectly amicable spirit." The young Earl of Brocklesby had made this somewhat lengthy, perfectly voluntary explanation of the state of affairs in a calm, quiet voice, with much dignity and perfect simplicity, but the coroner did not seem impressed by it, for he asked very drilly, "Did you part good friends?" "On my side, absolutely so." "But not on his?" insisted the coroner. "I think he felt naturally annoyed that he had been so ill-advised by his solicitors." "And you made no attempt later on in the day to adjust any ill feeling that may have existed between you and him?" asked the coroner, marking with strange, earnest emphasis every word he uttered. "If you mean did I go and see my brother again that day, no, I did not." "And your lordship can give us no further information which might throw some light upon the mystery which surrounds the Honorable Robert de Genneville's death?" still persisted the coroner. "I am sorry to say I cannot," replied the Earl of Brocklesby with firm decision. The coroner still looked puzzled and thoughtful. It seemed at first as if he wished to press his point further. Everyone felt that some deep import had lain behind his examination of the witness, and all were on tenterhooks as to what the next evidence might bring forth. The Earl of Brocklesby had waited a minute or two, then, at a sign from the coroner, had left the witness box in order to have a talk with his solicitor. At first he paid no attention to the depositions of the cashier and hall porter of the Castle Hotel, but gradually it seemed to strike him that curious statements were being made by these witnesses, and a frown of anxious wonder settled between his brows, whilst his young face lost some of its florid hue. Mr. Tremlett, the cashier at the hotel, had been holding the attention of the court. He stated that the Honorable Robert Ingram de Genneville had arrived at the hotel at 8 o'clock on the morning of the 13th. He had the room which he usually occupied when he came to the castle, namely number 21, and he went up to it immediately on his arrival, ordering some breakfast to be brought up to him. At 11 o'clock the Earl of Brocklesby called to see his brother and remained with him until about 12. In the afternoon the deceased went out, and returned for his dinner at 7 o'clock in company with a gentleman whom the cashier knew well by sight, Mr. Timothy Bedingfield, the lawyer of Paradise Street. The gentlemen had their dinner downstairs, and after that they went up to the Honorable Mr. de Genneville's room for coffee and cigars. "I could not say at what time Mr. Bedingfield left," continued the cashier, "but I rather fancy I saw him in the hall at about 9:15 p.m. He was wearing an Inverness cape over his dress clothes and a Glengarry cap. It was just at the hour when the visitors who had come down for the night from London were arriving thick and fast. The hall was very full, and there was a large party of Americans monopolizing most of our personnel, so I could not swear positively whether I did see Mr. Bedingfield or not then, though I am quite sure that it was Mr. Timothy Bedingfield who dined and spent the evening with the Honorable Mr. de Genneville, as I know him quite well by sight. At 10 o'clock I am off duty, and the night porter remains alone in the hall." Mr. Tremlett's evidence was corroborated in most respects by a waiter and by the hall porter. They had both seen the deceased come in at 7 o'clock in company with a gentleman, and their description of the latter coincided with that of the appearance of Mr. Timothy Bedingfield, whom, however, they did not actually know. At this point of the proceedings the foreman of the jury wished to know why Mr. Timothy Bedingfield's evidence had not been obtained, and was informed by the detective inspector in charge of the case that that gentleman had seemingly left Birmingham, but was expected home shortly. The coroner suggested an adjournment pending Mr. Bedingfield's appearance, but at the earnest request of the detective he consented to hear the evidence of Peter Tyrrell, the night porter at the Castle Hotel, who, if you remember the case at all, succeeded in creating the biggest sensation of any which had been made through this extraordinary and weirdly gruesome case. "It was the first time I had been on duty at the castle," he said, "for I used to be night porter at Bright's, in Wolverhampton, but just after I had come on duty at 10 o'clock a gentleman came and asked if he could see the Honorable Robert de Genneville. I said that I thought he was in, but would send up and see. The gentleman said, 'It doesn't matter, don't trouble, I know his room, 21, isn't it?' And up he went before I could say another word." "Did he give you any name?" asked the coroner. "No, sir." "What was he like?" "A young gentleman, sir, as far as I can remember, in an Inverness cape and Glengarry cap, but I could not see his face very well as he stood with his back to the light, and the cap shaded his eyes, and he only spoke to me for a minute." "Look all round you," said the coroner quietly. "Is there anyone in this court at all like the gentleman you speak of?" An odd hush fell over the many spectators there present as Peter Tyrrell, the night porter of the Castle Hotel, turned his head towards the body of the court and slowly scanned the many faces there present. For a moment he seemed to hesitate, only for a moment though, then, as if vaguely conscious of the terrible importance his next words might have, he shook his head gravely and said, "I wouldn't like to swear." The coroner tried to press him, but with true British stolidity he repeated, "I wouldn't like to say." "Well then, what happened?" asked the coroner, who had perforce to abandon his point. "The gentleman went upstairs, sir, and about a quarter of an hour later he come down again, and I let him out. He was in a great hurry then. He threw me a half-crown and said, 'Good night.' And though you saw him again then, you cannot tell us if you would know him again? Once more the hall porter's eyes wandered as if instinctively to a certain face in the court. Once more he hesitated for many seconds, which seemed like so many hours, during which a man's honor, a man's life, hung perhaps in the balance. Then Peter Tyrrell repeated slowly, "I wouldn't swear." But coroner and jury alike, I and every spectator in that crowded court, had seen that the man's eyes had rested during that one moment of hesitation upon the face of the Earl of Brocklesby. Do you trust what the witness left unsaid? The hesitation in their eyes? Could that be the answer? Chapter 33, The Living and the Dead. The man in the corner blinked across at Polly with his funny mild blue eyes. "No wonder you are puzzled," he continued. "So was everybody in the court that day, everyone save myself. I alone could see in my mind's eye that gruesome murder such as it had been committed, with all its details, and, above all, its motive, and such as you will see it presently, when I place it all clearly before you. But before you see daylight in this strange case, I must plunge you into further darkness, in the same manner as the coroner and jury were plunged on the following day, the second day of that remarkable inquest. It had to be adjourned, since the appearance of Mr. Timothy Bedingfield had now become of vital importance. The public had come to regard his absence from Birmingham at this critical moment as decidedly remarkable, to say the least of it, and all those who did not know the lawyer by sight wished to see him in his Inverness cape and Glengarry cap, such as he had appeared before the several witnesses on the night of the awful murder. When the coroner and jury were seated, the first piece of information which the police placed before them was the astounding statement that Mr. Timothy Bedingfield's whereabouts had not been ascertained, though it was confidently expected that he had not gone far and could easily be traced. There was a witness present who the police thought might throw some light as to the lawyer's probable destination, for obviously he had left Birmingham directly after his interview with the deceased. This witness was Mrs. Higgins, who was Mr. Bedingfield's housekeeper. She stated that her master was in the constant habit, especially latterly, of going up to London on business. He usually left by a late evening train on those occasions, and mostly was only absent 36 hours. He kept a portmanteau always ready packed for the purpose, for he often left at a few moments' notice. Mrs. Higgins added that her master stayed at the Great Western Hotel in London, for it was there that she was instructed to wire if anything urgent required his presence back in Birmingham. On the night of the 14th, she continued, at 9 o'clock or thereabouts, a messenger came to the door with the master's card, and said that he was instructed to fetch Mr. Bedingfield's portmanteau, and then to meet him at the station in time to catch the 9:35 p.m. up train. I gave him the portmanteau, of course, as he had brought the card, and I had no idea there could be anything wrong. But since then I have heard nothing of my master, and I don't know when he will return. Questioned by the coroner, she added that Mr. Bedingfield had never stayed away quite so long without having his letters forwarded to him. There was a large pile waiting for him now. She had written to the Great Western Hotel, London, asking what she should do about the letters, but had received no reply. She did not know the messenger by sight who had called for the portmanteau. Once or twice before Mr. Bedingfield had sent for his things in that manner when he had been dining out. Mr. Bedingfield certainly wore his Inverness cape over his dress clothes when he went out at about 6 o'clock in the afternoon. He also wore a Glengarry cap. The messenger had so far not yet been found, and from this point, namely the sending for the portmanteau, all traces of Mr. Timothy Bedingfield seemed to have been lost. Whether he went up to London by that 9:35 train or not could not be definitely ascertained. The police had questioned at least a dozen porters at the railway, as well as ticket collectors, but no one had any special recollection of a gentleman in an Inverness cape and Glengarry cap, a costume worn by more than one first-class passenger on a cold night in September. There was the hitch, you see, it all lay in this. Mr. Timothy Bedingfield, the lawyer, had undoubtedly made himself scarce. He was last seen in company with the deceased, and wearing an Inverness cape and Glengarry cap. 2 or 3 witnesses saw him leaving the hotel at about 9:15. Then the messenger calls at the lawyer's house for the portmanteau, after which Mr. Timothy Bedingfield seems to vanish into thin air. But, and that is a great but, The night porter at the castle seems to have seen someone wearing the momentous Inverness and Glengarry half an hour or so later on, and going up to deceased's room, where he stayed about a quarter of an hour. Undoubtedly, you will say, as everyone said to themselves that day after the night porter and Mrs. Higgins had been heard, that there was a very ugly and very black finger which pointed unpleasantly at Mr. Timothy Bedingfield, especially as that gentleman, for some reason which still required an explanation, was not there to put matters right for himself. But there was just one little thing, a mere trifle perhaps, which neither the coroner nor the jury dared to overlook, though, strictly speaking, it was not evidence. You will remember that when the night porter was asked if he could, among the persons present in court, recognize the Honorable Robert de Genneville's belated visitor, everyone had noticed his hesitation, and marked that the man's eyes had rested doubtingly upon the face and figure of the young Earl of Brocklesby. Now, if that belated visitor had been Mr. Timothy Bedingfield, tall, lean, dry as dust, with a bird-like beak and clean-shaven chin, no one could for a moment have mistaken his face, even if they only saw it very casually and recollected it but very dimly, with that of young Lord Brocklesby, who was florid and rather short. The only point in common between them was their Saxon hair. "You see that it was a curious point, don't you?" added the man in the corner, who now had become so excited that his fingers worked like long thin tentacles round and round his bit of string. It weighed very heavily in favor of Timothy Bedingfield. Added to which you must also remember that, as far as he was concerned, the Honorable Robert de Genneville was to him the goose with the golden eggs. The de Genneville peerage case had brought Bedingfield's name in great prominence. With the death of the claimant, all hopes of prolonging the litigation came to an end. There was a total lack of motive as far as Bedingfield was concerned. "Not so with the Earl of Brocklesby," said Polly, "and I've often maintained, what he interrupted, that the Earl of Brocklesby changed clothes with Bedingfield in order more conveniently to murder his own brother? Where and when could the exchange of costume have been effected, considering that the Inverness cape and Glengarry cap were in the hall of the Castle Hotel at 9:15, and at that hour and until 10 o'clock Lord Brocklesby was at the Grand Hotel finishing dinner with some friends. That was subsequently proved, remember, and also that he was back at Brocklesby Castle, which is 7 miles from Birmingham, at 11 o'clock sharp. Now, the visit of the individual in the Glengarry occurred some time after 10 p.m. Then there was the disappearance of Bedingfield," said the girl musingly. "That certainly points very strongly to him. He was a man in good practice, I believe, and fairly well known, and has never been heard of from that day to this," concluded the old scarecrow with a chuckle. "No wonder you are puzzled. The police were quite baffled, and still are, for a matter of that. And yet see how simple it is. Only the police would not look further than these two men. Lord Brocklesby with a strong motive and the night porter's hesitation against him, and Bedingfield without a motive, but with strong circumstantial evidence and his own disappearance as condemnatory signs. If only they would look at the case as I did, and think a little about the dead as well as about the living. If they had remembered that peerage case, the Honorable Robert's debts, his last straw which proved a futile claim. Only that very day the Earl of Brocklesby had, by quietly showing the original ancient document to his brother, persuaded him how futile were all his hopes. Who knows how many were the debts contracted, the promises made, the money borrowed and obtained on the strength of that claim which was mere romance. Ahead nothing but ruin, enmity with his brother, his marriage probably broken off, a wasted life, in fact. Is it small wonder that, though ill feeling against the Earl of Brocklesby may have been deep, there was hatred, bitter, deadly hatred against the man who with false promises had led him into so hopeless a quagmire? Probably the Honorable Robert owed a great deal of money to Bedingfield, which the latter hoped to recoup at usurious interest, with threats of scandal and what not. Think of all that he added, and then tell me if you believe that a stronger motive for the murder of such an enemy could well be found. But what you suggest is impossible, said Polly, aghast. Allow me, he said. It is more than possible. It is very easy and simple. The two men were alone together in the Honorable Robert de Genneville's room after dinner. You, as representing the public, and the police say that Bedingfield went away and returned half an hour later in order to kill his client. I say that it was the lawyer who was murdered at 9 o'clock that evening, and that Robert de Genneville, the ruined man, the hopeless bankrupt, was the assassin. Then, yes, of course, now you remember, for I have put you on the track. The face and the body were so battered and bruised that they were past recognition. Both men were of equal height. The hair, which alone could not be disfigured or obliterated, was in both men similar in color. Then the murderer proceeds to dress his victim in his own clothes. With the utmost care, he places his own rings on the fingers of the dead man, his own watch in the pocket. A gruesome task, but an important one, and it is thoroughly well done. Then he himself puts on the clothes of his victim, with finally the Inverness cape and Glengarry, and when the hall is full of visitors, he slips out unperceived. He sends the messenger for Bedingfield's portmanteau and starts off by the night express. But then his visit at the Castle Hotel at 10 o'clock, she urged. How dangerous! Dangerous? Yes, but oh, how clever. You see, he was the Earl of Brocklesby's twin brother, and twin brothers are always somewhat alike. He wished to appear dead, murdered by someone. He cared not whom, but what he did care about was to throw clouds of dust in the eyes of the police, and he succeeded with a vengeance. Perhaps. Who knows? He wished to assure himself that he had forgotten nothing in the Mise-en scene, that the body, battered and bruised past all semblance of any human shape save for its clothes, really would appear to everyone as that of the Honorable Robert de Genneville, while the latter disappeared forever from the old world and started life again in the new. Then you must always reckon with the practically invariable rule that a murderer always revisits, if only once, the scene of his crime. 2 years have elapsed since the crime. No trace of Timothy Bedingfield, the lawyer, has ever been found, and I can assure you that it will never be, for his plebeian body lies buried in the aristocratic family vault of the Earl of Brocklesby. He was gone before Polly could say another word. The faces of Timothy Bedingfield, of the Earl of Brocklesby, of the Honorable Robert de Genneville seemed to dance before her eyes and to mock her for the hopeless bewilderment in which she found herself plunged because of them. Then all the faces vanished, or rather, were merged in one long, thin, bird-like one, with bone-rimmed spectacles on the top of its beak and a wide, rude grin beneath it, and still puzzled, still doubtful, the young girl too paid for her scanty luncheon and went her way. Such a bold murderer, and yet this case ends here. The next case, an impossible crime? Chapter 34, The Mysterious Death in Percy Street. Miss Polly Burton had had many an argument with Mr. Richard Frobisher about that old man in the corner, who seemed far more interesting and deucedly more mysterious than any of the crimes over which he philosophized. Dick thought, moreover, that Miss Polly spent more of her leisure time now in that ABC shop than she had done in his own company before, and told her so, with that delightful air of sheepish sulkiness which the male creature invariably wears when he feels jealous and won't admit it. Polly liked Dick to be jealous, but she liked that old scarecrow in the ABC shop very much too, and though she made sundry vague promises from time to Mr. Richard Frobisher, she nevertheless drifted back instinctively day after day to the tea shop in Norfolk Street, Strand, and stayed there sipping coffee for as long as the man in the corner chose to talk. On this particular afternoon, she went to the ABC shop with a fixed purpose, that of making him give her his views of Mrs. Owen's mysterious death in Percy Street. The facts had interested and puzzled her. She had had countless arguments with Mr. Richard Frobisher as to the 3 great possible solutions of the puzzle. Accident? Suicide? Murder? Undoubtedly neither accident nor suicide, he said dryly. Polly was not aware that she had spoken. What an uncanny habit that creature had of reading her thoughts. You incline to the idea, then, that Mrs. Owen was murdered. Do you know by whom? He laughed, and drew forth the piece of string he always fidgeted with when unraveling some mystery. You would like to know who murdered that old woman? He asked at last. I would like to hear your views on the subject, Polly replied. I have no views, he said dryly. No one can know who murdered the woman, since no one ever saw the person who did it. No one can give the faintest description of the mysterious man who alone could have committed that clever deed, and the police are playing a game of blind man's buff. But you must have formed some theory of your own, she persisted. It annoyed her that the funny creature was obstinate about this point, and she tried to nettle his vanity. I suppose that as a matter of fact your original remark that there are no such things as mysteries does not apply universally. There is a mystery, that of the death in Percy Street, and you, like the police, are unable to fathom it. He pulled up his eyebrows and looked at her for a minute or two. Confess that that murder was one of the cleverest bits of work accomplished outside Russian diplomacy, he said with a nervous laugh. I must say that were I the judge, called upon to pronounce sentence of death on the man who conceived that murder, I could not bring myself to do it. I would politely request the gentleman to enter our Foreign Office. We have need of such men. The whole mise-en scene was truly artistic, worthy of its milieu. The Rubin Studios in Percy Street, Tottenham Court Road. Have you ever noticed them? They are only studios by name and are merely a set of rooms in a corner house, with the windows slightly enlarged, and the rents charged accordingly in consideration of that additional 5 inches of smoky daylight, filtering through dusty windows. On the ground floor there is the order office of some stained glass works, with a workshop in the rear, and on the first floor landing a small room allotted to the caretaker with gas, coal, and 15 shillings a week, for which princely income she is deputed to keep tidy and clean the general aspect of the house. Mrs. Owen, who was the caretaker there, was a quiet, respectable woman who eked out her scanty wages by sundry, mostly very meager, tips doled out to her by impecunious artists in exchange for promiscuous domestic services in and about the respective studios. But if Mrs. Owen's earnings were not large, they were very regular, and she had no fastidious tastes. She and her cockatoo lived on her wages, and all the tips added up and never spent, year after year, went to swell a very comfortable little account at interest in the Birkbeck Bank. This little account had mounted up to a very tidy sum, and the thrifty widow or old maid, no one ever knew which she was generally referred to by the young artists of the Rubin Studios as a lady of means. But this is a digression. No one slept on the premises except Mrs. Owen and her cockatoo. The rule was that one by one, as the tenants left their rooms in the evening, they took their respective keys to the caretaker's room. She would then, in the early morning, tidy and dust the studios and the office downstairs, lay the fire and carry up coals. The foreman of the glass works was the first to arrive in the morning. He had a latchkey and let himself in, after which it was the custom of the house that he should leave the street door open for the benefit of the other tenants and their visitors. Usually, when he came at about 9 o'clock, he found Mrs. Owen busy about the house doing her work, and he had often a brief chat with her about the weather, but on this particular morning of February 2nd, he neither saw nor heard her. However, as the shop had been tidied and the fire laid, he surmised that Mrs. Owen had finished her work earlier than usual, and thought no more about it. One by one, the tenants of the studios turned up, and the day sped on without anyone's attention being drawn noticeably to the fact that the caretaker had not appeared upon the scene. It had been a bitterly cold night, and the day was even worse. A cutting northeasterly gale was blowing. There had been a great deal of snow during the night, which lay quite thick on the ground, and at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when the last glimmer of the pale winter daylight had disappeared, the confraternity of the Brush put pallet and easel aside and prepared to go home. The first to leave was Mr. Charles Pitt. He locked up his studio and, as usual, took his key into the caretaker's room. He had just opened the door when an icy blast literally struck him in the face. Both the windows were wide open, and the snow and sleet were beating thickly into the room, forming already a white carpet upon the floor. The room was in semi-obscurity, and at first Mr. Pitt saw nothing, but instinctively realizing that something was wrong, he lit a match and saw before him the spectacle of that awful and mysterious tragedy which has ever since puzzled both police and public. On the floor, already half covered by the drifting snow, lay the body of Mrs. Owen face downwards, in a nightgown with feet and ankles bare, and these in her hands were of a deep purple color, whilst in a corner of the room, huddled up with the cold, the body of the cockatoo lay stark and stiff. Was Mrs. Owen killed because of her secret? What do you think? Haven't subscribed to our channel yet? Hit the subscribe button so you won't miss more adventures. See you tomorrow.